Welcome to Science Minds. Today we're very pleased to have Dr. Julie Lounds Taylor with us. So we'll kind of jump into things quickly, but welcome.
Thank you. It's such a pleasure to be here.
Oh, definitely. So I'd like to just start off and maybe have you tell a little bit about sort of your background, what got you interested in the field, and especially looking at adult transition and adult outcomes. So I'd love to hear your background.
Yeah, sure. So when I was in college, so a lot of people that go into the autism field have a family connection to autism, I feel like, and that was not really so much my story. So when I was in college and I was looking for a job to make a little bit of money, I went to college outside of Chicago, and they have this huge organization of special recreation associations there that runs Special Olympic sports and social clubs for people with disabilities and all kinds of different programming. And I hadn't had a lot of experience with disabilities, really any, before that. I mean, when I was in school, I don't think there was anybody with disabilities in my school. There wasn't a lot of inclusion. I grew up in a small town in Michigan and hadn't had a lot of experience, but thought, well, this sounds like it could be a fun thing. So ran some social clubs for adults with disabilities, which was super fun. Coached some Special Olympic sports, did a handful of other things, and first of all, kind of fell in love with the population just by having contact and working with them, but also realized that some of the families and some of the individuals seemed to really, really be thriving and really seemed to have things together and things were kind of clicking along, and other families seemed to really be struggling. And it wasn't always super obvious why or what the differences were, and sort of started to get interested in trying to understand and figure out, like, when does life go well for these guys and when does it seem to be challenging? So applied to graduate schools in psychology and went to University of Notre Dame for developmental psychology, and actually worked on something semi-related, which was a study of adolescent mothers and their children, which doesn't sound related, but with these kids, when they were born, from what you can tell in an early IQ test, like they all, for the most part, were kind of scoring in the normal range with what you can tell from a 6-month-old, right? But by the time they were 5, a lot of the kids born to the adolescent mothers were significantly developmentally delayed on their tests. So there was sort of this discussion, and a big part of the project was really thinking about what are some of the environmental causes of intellectual disability or developmental disability. And I did a lot of work on parenting and parent-child relationship, which I was really interested in. But over the course of that work, I really came to know and to understand that, like, people with diagnosed disabilities was really sort of where my passions were. And I wasn't quite sure, in my process, and I was like, I'm really interested in the parent-child relationship, and here's sort of a really interesting way to think about disability. But went to conferences where people were doing disability work and things, and I was like, man, that's what I want to be doing. So I took a postdoctoral position at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, working with Marcia Malik there, who had a longitudinal study of families of adolescents and adults with autism. And that was really where I got a lot of my autism expertise and sort of realized that that's really what I want to do. Now, that study wasn't focused on the transition to adulthood, but they had a lot of people in that study that were transitioning to adulthood over the course of the study, and families would tell us about how worried they were about what was going to happen when their son or daughter left high school. And this was like 2005, 2006, and there really was very little in the literature right now to even be able to say to families, like, here's what to expect, or here's what will be helpful. And so I think just kind of hearing what families were saying and realizing that this was such a salient turning point in the lives of these families, but we don't really have a lot of evidence about what to tell them, about what to expect, or the range of what may happen, or even what's going to be helpful, really led me to sort of be interested in going down that line of trying to understand what happens during the transition to adulthood and how we can make that go a little smoother for individuals and for families. Yeah. That was a long answer.
That's a great answer, though. That's really cool. That's awesome. I want to pause on the more academic stuff, and I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of a little of like your personal life, of what kind of hobbies you have, what you're sort of into outside of your job, your research. I
have kids who are now 8 and 10, and I feel like I'm just getting to the point in my life where I can actually maybe start having some hobbies again.
I can relate to that.
In addition to work. So my hobbies are kind of, I feel like there are people that have such interesting things that they do. When I'm not working or when I'm not with my kids, I love to watch TV.
Yeah, that's great.
I do. It's fun to like go out and do errands by myself. I like to run. I like to run.
Okay.
But I feel like I'm actually, I'm at a point in my personal life where I can start to think about what my hobbies might be in a way that I don't know that I was. Maybe maybe a few years ago I would have been at that place, but then we had the pandemic, right? Mm-hmm. And my kids were home all the time. And so there were no hobbies that were going. I was trying to work and homeschool and do all the things, right? Yeah. And so I don't know what my hobbies are gonna be. I like to run. I used to play tennis. Maybe I'll pick that up again. I like to read. I love to read. Fun things, not like informational things, which I do a lot of that, but I really enjoy like getting into a good novel, doing things that sort of turn other things off and I can just sort of escape a little bit. Yeah. But I'm not sure I feel like I'm just at a place where I can start thinking about what hobbies I might have.
That's cool.
It's kind of a sad answer.
It's not a sad. I don't think so at all. I think we hit this question along the trajectory of people's careers, and it's interesting. We've had some folks on who are talk about like going out in their gardens and collecting all these different plants and making natural dyes with them and doing all this really cool stuff. So maybe later on in the career,
yes, I'm convinced. Ask me again in 5 or 6 years. I have to say, like, my kids are at this age right now where they are so fun. I mean, 8 and 10, like those are great ages. And I know it's going to get hard coming up. So I'm seeing a nod over there. So any chance I get to like be with them, even if it's like taking them out to dinner or like, I am loving that right now because we're just in this real sweet spot. And I can sense, even with my older kid, that things are going to start changing soon. So it's like sappy and it sounds, but like that's kind of my hobby right now is being able to do fun things with them that aren't. Yeah. But I'm aware that it will probably start being less fun relatively soon. And then I'll start to find other ways to have a good time.
Definitely. That's great. That's a great answer. Pivoting back into more kind of research and inquiry things, I'm really interested in what you're doing. I think that focusing on the transition to adulthood for people with disabilities, people with autism, is so important. And looking at some of your recent work, especially with how families have fared through the pandemic, you've sort of talked a little bit about, families' experiences with services in that space, how things have changed for them. And I'm wondering, kind of as we're hopefully moving more and more out of the pandemic, I'm wondering how you sort of foresee those kinds of services, outcomes for people with developmental disabilities. How do you see that trajectory maybe being altered by the pandemic? Or do you think it's going to return to just as it was? I'm interested in your perspective on that. Yeah,
I think there are going to be some things that come out of the pandemic that are going to be positives in terms of outcomes and in terms, I think the ways that people apply for services and getting access to services, I think there are more options than there used to be. I know for some places, like if you wanted to fill out an application for SSI, you may have had to do that in person and go into the office and they by necessity had to move some things online, have more training materials sometimes online for different things that I think. Now, I'm not saying that it's been easier for families to get services because I think it's actually been significantly harder, just with having a harder time getting in touch with people. But I do think there have been some changes by necessity that have made some of the processes a little bit more flexible that I think hopefully will serve families well. And I think even having how we deliver the services be a little bit more flexible, I think has the potential to serve people well. I don't know that it always does, but I think there's the potential for that to sort of target services towards modalities that work well for certain people. I do think, I don't have good research on this really, but I do think we've seen some adults with autism specifically that it's been kind of hard to get back out into the world after being home for a while. And there are just a lot of things about being out in the world that are kind of stressful and things you have to navigate. I see this even with my research assistants who are not necessarily on the autism spectrum, that once they've been working from home for a little while, to sort of commute into the office and to get ready for work and do all those things feels like a little bit of a barrier,
Yeah.
a challenge. And I think for people with disabilities, I think that for some people at least, it's going to be a really significant barrier, if not already, is sort of, I think for some people there was like momentum in terms of sort of moving and working towards employment and doing things, and then that kind of paused, and sort of getting that momentum going again and getting out in the world and getting used to taking transportation to where you're going to go and sort of interacting with other people on a regular basis, I think for some people is going to be pretty challenging. But at least in our research, we've seen a lot of people that have been bouncing back pretty well. And I think the job market being as good as it is right now for job seekers has been a helpful thing for some people. So I'm hopeful that, and I do think that maybe there is going to continue to be some flexibility in terms of what work looks like, at least for people who don't require as many supports in the workplace. I don't know how much flexibility there's going to be for people who require more supports, and we don't know as much about those individuals really, from a research perspective at least. But my hope is that some of the positives in terms of flexibility, more possibilities for meaningful remote work for people that works well for, will hopefully stick around, and flexibility in terms of figuring out how to get services. But I do think sort of moving sort of out of inertia and moving back into kind of moving forward on things, I think can be tricky for people for a lot of different reasons.
Yeah.
So we'll see.
For sure. On this same sort of theme of change, I'm really interested to know whether, and the follow-up is how, if so, your perspectives on adult transition and adult employment have maybe changed over your career, or been influenced by different, like the self-advocacy movement, the neurodiversity movement.
Well, I think my perspective, and I think the perspective of the field about what should be the outcomes of what we're targeting here, I think has gotten more sophisticated over time. Certainly my perspective has. I think when I started working on employment and thinking about that, it was really kind of, are people working or are they not? And maybe some focus on how independently they're able to work within the context of that. And I think that's still important. But I really think we've become a little bit more sophisticated. If somebody has a job but they hate it, whether they have autism or whether they don't, like that's probably not what we should be shooting for, right? And so we've done a lot of thinking, at least, about what is the purpose of employment. And making money and being able to support yourself is one purpose. The other is to really be meaningfully engaged in your community, I think. And so there may be ways that we can facilitate that outside of an employment outside of an employment experience, so especially for people that might find employment really challenging. I think so. And the other thing that I think has sort of become more prominent in my thinking over time is the role of just sort of like positive mental health, thriving, well-being, and again, some of these things like employment, and where it are hopefully maybe a means to an end for somebody to thrive, to have a life that they feel good about and happy about. And I don't exactly 100% know how we measure that. I don't know how that becomes our outcome measure, but I think that's what we need to be shooting for. And sort of some of these other things like work or where people are living or whatever are more of a means to an end, if that makes sense, as opposed to the outcome itself. And that all of these things should be working towards the function of really helping people meaningfully be parts of their communities and to sort of thrive and be happy, and which sounds a little Pollyanna-ish, but I think for any of us, autistic or not, whether we're working or not, is not necessarily the end game. It's really having a life that we find fulfilling. And absolutely. so I haven't quite figured out. It's hard to get a grant to measure and understand having a fulfilling life. And so we've sort of teased apart some of the things that we think are part of that, right? And we're investigating those things. But I think the ultimate end game, for me at least in my work, is not to figure out how to get somebody into a job, but to figure out how to get them into a job that's going to be meaningful for them and lead to a life where they feel like they can thrive.
Yeah, that's awesome. Something I really admire about your work is just the complexity that is inherent in helping people thrive. There's so many factors. Family, school, individual. It's just, there's so much to tease apart and work through. And I really respect that about your work of going through to really tease it apart and identify some of like areas of need and barriers and those kinds of things. Malcolm Gladwell has this really interesting podcast where he gives researchers a magic wand to do whatever they want and do any kind of research they want. But I'm interested to know, if you had a magic wand, what do you think would be the most important or areas that if you could just wave the magic wand and make the issues disappear or figure it out what that problem is, or make some kind of a change along the trajectory of all the complexity, where do you sort of see that area being kind of most just important or interesting or
Yeah, ooh, that's a good question. The thing that I love about that question is every single person that you ask will give you a different answer to that, even if we're kind of thinking about the same things, which is cool. And I might give you a different answer next week than what I would give you right now. But I think right now, what I'm really struck by is how hard, disappointed isn't the right word, but it's just so incredibly difficult for families and individuals to get the services and supports that they need, especially in adulthood, to thrive. There's so many barriers in place to getting services and supports at all. And that's not even talking about getting the right thing to the right person in the right dosage, and we don't even really know how to measure that very well, by the way. But the service system is just so complicated and so underfunded that there are people who have so much potential to really thrive and to participate, and they just can't get the right kind of help or support to help them to do that. And so if I could wave a magic wand, it would be figuring out how to restructure this whole adult service system to make it easier, but let's say easy, right? Not even easier, to make it easy to identify what is going to get a person where they want to be, figure out what that is, first of all, and then to identify how to get the most effective support to that person to put them there. I don't know how we fix that. So we have an intervention where we're trying to help parents navigate the service system as it is, understanding that it's hard and they're probably not going to get all of what they need. I had the chance to sit in on a federal advisory committee about the transition to adulthood, and the biggest outcome that came out of that is that we need to revamp the adult service system and make it more integrated and easier. And the federal members of that advisory committee were like, well, that's just too hard. And it's like, well, if you can't do it, like you're the people that can do it. And so it's a grand challenge, but and the funding is a big piece of that too. It's not just that the service system is hard to navigate, it's that there just isn't enough money there to help people. But if we could figure that out, if we could get the right know what that right effective support is for that person to help them sort of reach their goals or to thrive or however we want to define it, and then get that to them in a meaningful way, we'd see a real sea change in mental health and employment and all these different things that we care about. And there are other ways to work around it, right? We're trying to figure out all kinds of how do we support families better, how do we do all that also really matter a lot. But we would change people's lives if we could change the adult service system, right?
Absolutely.
So that's what I would wave my magic wand and do. I would make it really easy for people to get what they need.
A final question, just kind of thinking about the future and looking at sort of the trajectory of your work and the work in the field. What are you excited about or hopeful about?
You actually touched on this just a second ago. I'm really excited that I feel like our thinking about how to support people, I think, is becoming, especially in adulthood, but across the lifespan, is, I think, becoming more nuanced and reflecting reality. I think, the adult field and transition to adulthood and autism is a pretty young area of study. So there were a lot of studies, including studies that we did, that were really just trying to define what the challenges are, kind of wrap our heads around the issue. And I feel like we're moving to the next stage of not only trying to figure out what to do about it, but to really think. Many people now are thinking about outcomes and really grappling with what is how do we measure adult life in ways that are meaningful to people? How do we capture some of this nuance in our work? How do we incorporate the voices of families of autistic people to make sure that we're measuring what really matters? And and it's making our work richer. I think it's making our work more reflective of reality for people, and I think what comes of that is going to have a greater likelihood of being meaningful and so I'm excited about that. I feel like there's a little bit of a sea change in the field that we're moving, at least in the areas that I'm thinking a lot about. We're moving past sort of like, let's describe the issues, and we're also moving past like, I'm gonna try this reasonably simple kind of silver bullet thing that we think is gonna change outcomes for all people, and starting to think really carefully about getting the right intervention or supports to the right people, and how do we define that, and what does that look like. And on one hand, it's really frustrating because there aren't easy answers, but on the other hand, it's really exciting because I think grappling with these things gets us to a place where we're actually doing more meaningful work down the road. So it's hard, but that's the way, that's the way research goes. If you're gonna think about things in any sort of depth, it becomes extremely complex pretty quick, right?
Absolutely. Well, again, your work is very, very inspiring, and it's been lovely to chat with you. So thank you so much for joining us.
It's been so nice to chat with you as well. Thank you.
Thanks.
The UC Davis Mind Institute was founded in 1998 with the promise to reduce and prevent the disabilities that can be associated with autism and other neurodevelopmental conditions. Every day, our clinicians and researchers make progress on that promise. Our groundbreaking research on autism, Fragile X syndrome, chromosome 22q11.2 deletion syndrome, ADHD, and other conditions associated with disability are helping affected individuals achieve their fullest potential. Please visit our website or our social media platforms to find out more about current studies, upcoming events, and how you can help make a difference.